Welcome, everybody. Let me welcome you to our fourth of the Stone Lectures this week. My name is Lisa Cleeth. I'm Assistant Professor of Old Testament here. Can you not hear me? A little louder? Let me see if I can turn up the thing. Yeah, back in the back. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I know we've already heard a lot about Professor Seow's accomplishments this week, but I just want to add my own perspective to this litany of praise that we've heard. I've never met you before this week, Professor Seow, but I had met your shadow many times before. I would say not only in the grammar book that you wrote, in your many publications, through many of your former students, but also in teaching Intro to Old Testament in Stuart 6, as you did as well. No pressure there, right? But what I've learned about you this week is that you're a very humble man who's dedicated to lifelong learning, which I find to be very inspirational. I've learned that you wrote your grammar book for your students, even though you don't want to be known for that. Everybody who does not want to be known for that. It might be a little late. I've also learned that you have a turn towards the creative and towards the arts, which we very much benefited from in your lectures this week. I also want to reflect to you what a difference you've made as an Asian scholar in biblical studies. I took an informal survey of some of us Asian and Asian American biblical scholars. I might have been included in that survey, also Dr. Kim. And there's a collective sense of gratitude for all of your accomplishments. We really feel a lot of respect and admiration for the path that you have laid out before us. And I think even for those of us that had never met you, it feels like you have opened up possibilities in our imaginations for what can be. So I want to render a lot of gratitude towards you for the example you've given of deep scholarship and generous teaching, as we've heard about before. So thank you very much. So everyone, let's welcome again for our fourth lecture, Professor Seow.
Thank you very much for your kind words. So I'm trying to cram a huge topic so that we have room for tomorrow's lecture on Job's response and the epilogue. So when the learned John Milton wrote Paradise Lost in the 1660s, scholarship on Behemoth and Leviathan, the two extraordinary creatures Yahweh presents in the second divine discourse, was in transition. Milton seems to cast Leviathan as a whale, huges that swim the ocean, happily slumbering on a Norway foam. At the same time, Leviathan seems to have features of a mythic elephant, wallowing unwieldy, enormous in their gait, tempers the ocean. There, Leviathan, huges of living creatures on the deep. But notice, it gets too close. Oh, maybe it's the next, yeah. Sleeps or swims, seems a moving land, and at his gills, and he's got a trunk. So that seems to be the elephant. But as for Behemoth, he was the biggest born of the earth, upheaved his vastness between the sea and land, the river horse and scaly crocodile. That's interesting because that's quite different from the whale and the elephant. Milton's views in some ways reflect the influence of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, in his literal commentary on Job, written around 1265, widely regarded as a landmark in exegesis of the book, in that it departs from the long-standing allegorical approach that had been prevalent among Christians since Origen in the 3rd century. For Aquinas, Behemoth and Leviathan are literal animals, he said, the elephant and the whale, respectively. And yet, they are corporeal forms, the Latin figuras corporum, of the devil, made corporeal by God to accommodate the limited rational capacity of corporeal human beings. Notice, the literal animal is a figuras. So it's literal and yet figurative. Literal animals are figurative. The properties of these animals are such that they point to the devil. This approach dominated Christian interpretation in the West until the mid-16th century. And yet, despite the emphasis on the literal, the gist of the exegesis is consistent with the earlier allegorical interpretation. So even though they're literal animals, they represent the devil. And the two animals are really one and the same. So in effect, it was not different from Origen's interpretation, even though these are literal animals. The first non-literal interpretation comes from John Calvin's sermons in 1555, where Calvin followed Aquinas, identifying Behemoth as the elephant and Leviathan as the whale. But these are strictly literal with no symbolic meaning at all. So it's the first time in history of interpretation among Christians anyway, where these are literal animals. The purpose in the presentation of these animals is to evoke wonder. The huge size of the animals evoke wonder at the power of the Creator. And this underscores the inadequacy of humankind. After Calvin, Protestants followed Calvin mostly. Reformed scholars followed Calvin entirely. Lutherans were less committed. But Catholics continued to follow Aquinas through much of the early modern period. All that changed in 1663, when Protestant minister Samuel Bochart, in a learned treatise on sacred fauna, argued that Behemoth is the hippopotamus and Leviathan is the crocodile. So P.T. Barnum then, in his 1851 circus exhibit of the great behemoth of Scripture, invites people to come and view the great behemoth of the Bible, which is the hippopotamus. The most well-known animal trainer of that time, Van Amberg, says, in fact, you're practically offending God not to see a menagerie. In the book of Job, have the Lord telling Job to, behold now, behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Biblical scholars identified behemoth as hippopotamus. Well, where could you see the hippo? But in the menagerie, or menagerie at the circus. So if you don't go to circus, you are disobeying God. So this became a dominant interpretation in the modern period. But what's the point of all of this? So scholars follow Calvin by and large, follow Calvin's view. These creatures are presented to evoke wonder at the power of God and to remind human beings to be humble before God. To which George Bernard Shaw says, that's ignoble irrelevance. You're telling God, I'm really suffering, and God says, yeah, but can you make a hippo? So in modern scholarship, there have been different views. Many scholars take the animals to be literal, most often hippopotamus and crocodile, sometimes the water buffalo and the crocodile, or most recently, Michael Fox, hippopotamus and a whale. Others think it's mythological, it's the 19th century, monsters in Mesopotamian literature, or monsters in Ugaritic. Then there are others that say animals are literal but symbolic, mainly following the view of Aquinas. And I might note that these scholars are Catholic scholars. So of Markale, for instance, the animals are hippopotamus and crocodile, but they represent chaos. But what do these have to do with the topic of the speech? So the topic of the speech, as I suggested several times, goes back to 440, 7, and 8. So the topic is mishpat, right? Mishpat. There we go. So the vocabulary in verse 8 culminates a persistent theme in the book: justice, mishpat, occurring 23 times in various senses, along with tzedek, tzadak, right 35 times, and wrong. So Job has seen the problem of suffering only in legal and moral terms. For him, there can be only one or two conclusions regarding his suffering. Either he's being punished for wrong, or God is wrongly punishing him. And so Job concludes that he must declare God to be wrong if he were to be in the right. Poignantly, Job, in a short solemn oath in chapter 27, accuses God of disregarding his mishpat. So you can tell from the vocabulary there that God's response in some ways answers Job's solemn oath in chapter 27. Oh, no, it's okay. I thought it was me. So Yahweh's retort is to Job that Job is the one who's disregarded the deity's mishpat, meaning mishpat in the sense of divine prerogative of judgment. Yahweh's mishpat is delimited by human understanding of retributive, compensating justice, as Martin Buber put it. It is rather the Creator's, so God is not talking about retributive justice, it's rather God's distributive justice, the prerogative of the deity of judgment, executive justice of the Creator, ruler of all creatures, including the monstrous. So this is not the same as retributive justice. The stanza that follows reads like a challenger's taunt of a would-be opponent in a contest. Yahweh asks if Job has an arm like God's, or if he can thunder like the deity. Notably, the arm of God is a metaphor for wielding a divine power over the cosmos through victory over various chaos monsters. So Psalm 89, verse 10, and Isaiah 51, verse 9. Thus, God, by defeating these monsters, established mishpat, justice, as a foundation of divine kingship. So Psalm 89, verse 14. Yahweh then invites Job to play dress up, so to speak, with the majestic royal accoutrements, pride and pomp, and glory and grandeur. Job, who has been so exasperated about the lack of mishpat in his experience, is now challenged to assume the role of a sovereign, erupting with an outburst of anger, an expression that almost always refers to divine rage against disorder. Thus, a psalmist who suffers injustice at the hand of the wicked appeals to the deity to manifest anger and outbursts as one who has ordained justice. So Psalm 7, verse 6. Job is challenged to exercise such retributive mishpat without exception, as if he could somehow see every proud creature. And if Job is able to crush them as they are, keep them out of sight, then even Yahweh will confess Job. It was used 100 times. It's the only instance of God using to a human being. If you can do all this, I'll acknowledge you. I'll confess you and give thanks to you. All meanings of the Hebrew. So the taunt begins with a reference to the divine arm. It ends with Job's right hand. The victorious right hand is reminiscent of doxologies, affirming God's power over chaos. The framing of the taunts by the arm and the right hand is critical, for these are metaphors of divine power. They pertain to Yahweh's role as one who maintains mishpat. Job, who is then presented with an example of a creature over which he has no jurisdiction, Behemoth, who is Job's fellow creatures. All attempts to identify Behemoth with a specific monster, whether it be natural or mythological, invariably fall short, in my view. the depiction in verses 16 to 18 seems generic enough to suit a number of powerful animals, though it matches no animal in particular. None of the distinctive features of the most commonly accepted candidates for behemoth seem to fit. Hippopotamus, elephant, wild ox, buffalo. There's nothing said about a large mouth or long fangs or trunks or tusks or horns. All the most important features are absent. If this is hippopotamus, why nothing about a mouth? If this is about elephant, why no trunk? If this is wild ox, why nothing about a horn? All the most important features are absent. So this is not a taxonomy of an animal, certainly not one that we can identify. Indeed, the lack of an analog may be the point of the ode. Behemoth is vaguely familiar, like other large animals, and yet ultimately unheimlich, uncanny. The passage does not provide a zoological taxonomy. It reads rather like an ode to a potentate. Royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia are replete with similar idioms regarding the bodies of potentates, their size, their muscles, limbs, vigor, their virility, which are often compared to powerful bovine analogues. Among the earliest examples are a series of hymns by King Shugi of Ur from around 2100 BCE. He speaks of his physical stature, his muscles, limbs, virility, sex appeal. He sees himself as a great wild bull, bull of heaven, great bull with splendid limbs. So most of these we can identify with our passage. In other odes of power, Marduk is said his figure was substantial, he was virile at his emergence, powerful from the start. His members were sculpted beyond comprehension, and he was lofty among the gods, superb in body, his limbs long. Of Gilgamesh, we read in one of the oldest texts, the Gilgamesh was a wild bull with splendid limbs. In one passage in Gilgamesh, let me show you Gilgamesh, a man of all seasons. Look at him, see his appearance, well-formed in manliness, possessing awesomeness. His entire body is imbued with vigor. So all is interesting. But given that the topic is justice, it's interesting to compare the scenes with the so-called bison men in contest scenes. These are scenes of humanoid figures, hybrid creatures, humanoid figures, humanoid bovine faces, human torso, bovine lower body, and most notably, muscular lower limbs. These so-called bison men often appear with erect phallus, as you see in the examples here, erect phallus, or as having intercourse. All themes we find in the description of behemoths. Given the topic of justice, there's another example here, another set again, you see bison men and animals with erect penis. Given the topic of justice, it is not amiss to note that apart from the contest scenes in glyptic art, bison men are associated with the Mesopotamian sun god, the god of justice and order. From Tel Abu Haba, ancient Sippar, the Babylonian center of the veneration of sun god, comes a stone tablet dated to around 870 BCE. The upper part of the tablet shows Nabu Apla Edina of Babylon sitting on a throne on which are carved two bison men, propping up the seat, which represents the sky. Here is a close-up. You see the bison men at the bottom, propping up the throne. This iconography supports a common claim in Mesopotamian literature of justice as the base of the divine throne, a trope we find in the Bible as well, Psalm 89:14 and Psalm 97:2. From around the same period come several stone reliefs from northern Syria and southern Anatolia, showing bison men holding up a winged disc, which is set upon a footstool representing the sky. Compare Isaiah 66:1, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. All this is not to say, there's another example here, same thing, with a footstool holding up a winged sun disk. So all this is not to say that we should identify behemoths with such bison men, though I'm mightily tempted to do so. After all, order and justice are precisely the point in the discourse. Furthermore, Behemoth is both like a human, he was with Job, but also like bovine creatures. So verse 15. These iconographic parallels point the reader of Yahweh's discourse beyond the dichotomy of natural animals versus mythical creatures. They also suggest that we ought not to presume the beast to be a symbol of evil or an adversary of God in a battle with chaos. So what does Behemoth represent? Irene Winter has argued that the eroticized male body represented potency in all senses of the term, in text and in iconography, as we see in Gudea, muscular Gudea. So, kings are typically represented as having spectacularly potent bodies, powerful and virile. So the statue of Gudea. This potency is clearly evident in the famous victory stela of Naram Sin of Agade, which shows the king standing confidently on a slope. His sculptured body is larger than others, well-formed buttocks, muscular limbs, broad chest, and flat abdomen. His right hand holds an arrow, while his left hand clasps a bow, common symbols of sexual potency in text and iconography. The battle kilt covers his loin, held at the waist by a girdle tied in a knot. He wears a helmet with bull's horn, a symbol of supra-mundane power, hitherto reserved only for the gods. Naram Sin is thus cast as a divine king. Such hyperboles are common in Assyrian robber propaganda. At issue in all these examples is power beyond what human beings ordinarily possess. Such power is precisely what is at stake in the Behemoth passage, as is clear from the preceding taunt. The ode reaches a climax, a crescendo in verse 19a, which affirms Behemoth as the first of God's ways, which echoes wisdom's self-characterization in Proverbs 8:22. Yahweh created me as the first of his ways. In the latter case, the temporal sense of first seems to be clear from a parallel line. First is parallel to before his acts of yore, suggesting a temporal first. At the same time, first may not only be temporal, but also qualitative. First in eminence, first in quality, the first of God's ways, that is the best of God's creation. Just as wisdom is the best manifestations of God's creativity, so too Behemoth is the manifestation of the best of God's creativity. Yahweh's commendation of Behemoth as the first of God's way is remarkable, for elsewhere in the Bible, Behemoth compared with wisdom, elsewhere in the Bible, Behemoth is associated with stupidity or ignorance, as in Psalm 73:22. But Behemoth in Yahweh's discourse subverts traditional understanding of the place of humanity in creation, a critical question in both divine speeches. So human beings now are not at the acme of creation, contrary to Genesis 1. Even on dry land, where humans dwell, it is Behemoth who is first, and it is he who rules, contrary to Genesis 1:26 and 27. Supporting these claims of Behemoth's supremacy over dry land, the poet speaks of mountains bringing him their yield, a term also meaning tribute. The Hebrew verb for bring is used of arboreal yield, strikingly with mountains as the ones bringing the yield to the fore. So Ezekiel 17:23 and 36:8. Yet this is also the verb for bearing tribute. The dual meaning of yield and tribute is evident as well in the Akkadian cognate, which similarly refers to yield or tribute, including flora, fauna, and minerals of the mountain. To the lowlanders of Mesopotamia, the Zagros Mountains to the north, and especially the northwest, along with the sea, represented the most remote frontiers of the cosmos. Political dominance of these frontiers signified control of the far reaches of the universe, and hence the receipt of yields from the mountains was a common trope for divine and royal power. So you find the Arab epic bringing the yield. Gilgamesh, they bring yield to you from the mountains as a tribute. Shalmaneser the first, heavy tribute of the mountains. All over inscriptions, talk about. So the tribute of the mountain is a mark of power. Tikkun Nota, tribute of the lands, produce of the mountains, and so forth. Ashurnasirpal II, the master propagandist among the Assyrians, ruled all the mountains and received their tribute. And in his palace, you get this image of emissaries bringing tribute. And the emissaries come from the northwest, as you can tell from the shoes that they wear with the curled toe. That's typical of Syrian footwear. So emissaries bring tribute from the mountains to Ashur-Nasirpal. In Ugaritic as well, we have a similar theme. When whilst victorious, text says, "Let the mountains bring you much silver, the hills much desired gold. Let them bring you magnificent gems." The language in verse 20 is also reminiscent of Psalm 72, which imagines the mountains bringing the yield because of God's bestowal of mishpat upon the king, the earthly representative of the celestial king. So too the poet of Job personifies the mountains as behemoth vessels, bringing their yield as a tribute to the one who rules over dry land. This verse is not about the mountains producing food for the sustenance of behemoth hippopotamus, as many interpreters suggest. NRSV, the mountains yield food for you. That's not what the text says. It is about behemoth's power as ruler of the dry land and indeed of the universe. Just as dominion over the mountains signify power over the extremities of the world, so wild animals playing there suggest universal supremacy. This trope of royal control of the extremities of the world was common in Mesopotamian propaganda. The Neo-Assyrian kings created microcosms of the universe in the form of royal parks with exotic flora and fauna from the mountains to symbolize their control of the far edges of the universe. Populating these parks are wild animals roaming free or are in repose, at ease, as it were, thanks to the beneficence of the royal provider. And this spectacle of royal power is reinforced in iconography. These scenes illuminate both lines of the couplet in verse 20. Corroborating what is at issue in the passage is the power necessary for the exercise of mishpat. Nonetheless, whereas Behemoth in verse 19 and 20 is clearly a ruler over dry land and the one who received tribute from the mountains, he's suddenly in a marsh. The Hebrew word for marsh is a rare one. It refers to a waterlogged land where reeds and rushes thrive, provided it is not dried up. So in 8:11. Analogous terms in Akkadian for reed marsh are used in inscriptions referring to the artificial marsh that Sennacherib established as part of his royal park, as we've seen in this one. So these terms refer to the region where the marshes grow, where southern Iraq, right? where the willows or the brooks grow profusely. Contrary to Sennacherib's propaganda, however, this marshland was actually beyond his control. In fact, so his rivals will flee to the marshland and hide among the reeds, as we see in this picture. Now, this word for marsh, the word for marsh is also a word for morass. Right? As in Akkadian literature, morass and marsh use the same word in Akkadian. So the marsh in verse 21 is not a natural habitat of behemoth, whose domain is the dry land and the mountains. If one understands behemoth to represent the proud, to whom the taunt refers in verses 11 and 12, as Carol Newsom has suggested, then this behemoth's present situation in the marsh indicates his abasement. If so, the point is divine control of the proud potentate of dry land, corresponding to the limit Yahweh placed on the chaotic waters, so Newsom argues. Yet the poet does not indicate any hostility between Yahweh and behemoth. On the contrary, it is Yahweh who exalts behemoth as the first. Indeed, the poet implies that even in the marsh, even in the morass, the morass is the site of divine providence. The terms covert, cover, shelter, these terms all echo divine care in the Psalms. So the text seems to suggest that God cares for behemoth when behemoth is in the morass. Beyond the liminal space of the marsh, even in the most treacherous waters, behemoth remains secure. The Hebrew verb for the river's pool in verse 23 is one used of oppressive and violent conduct. It appears one other time in the book where Job accuses God of acting oppressively towards him. In Behemoth's case, the oppressive pool is the river's current. Even in the face of danger, in the fear of drowning, he is not in haste, he is not alarmed. The Hebrew expression indicating confidence in the face of danger, as in Deuteronomy 20, verse 3, and elsewhere. A psalmist expresses confidence in the covert and the shelter of divine presence, Psalm 31, 21, but he was alarmed when he thought he was cut off from that presence, Psalm 31, 23. Behemoth, by contrast, is not alarmed, even in dire circumstances, but he remains confident. He is confident even if the river rushes to his mouth. Behemoth is confident even when a river rushes, even in fear of drowning. Given the allusion in the preceding verses to divine care and protection, one is perhaps to understand that behemoth, even in the face of oppressive conditions, is nevertheless secure. Even an exalted monster can find itself in such a morass, it seems. Though contrary to human expectations of justice, the morass can be a site of providence for the monster. At the same time, the reader may discern a lesson here in this passage from the example of this monstrous other. The poet's choice of words in verse 23, which has so confounded many interpreters, is deliberate. Unlike Job, who responded to adversity by accusing God of oppression, the monster responds to the river's oppression by being not alarmed. Monster responds with equanimity. Patient behemoth shows up impatient Job. Even when the river gushes into his mouth, the monster remains confident. Hebrew batach, belief or trust. Job himself knows well the dangers of overwhelming waters, for he speaks of caravans venturing into treacherous wadis without recognizing the dangers of flash floods, only to regret their misplaced trust. Batach 6:20. Behemoth, however, remains trusting, confident, even under duress. He remains faithful. Interpreters who detect here a subliminal message to Job may be right to suggest that Behemoth presents God presents Behemoth, his foremost creatures, as an object lesson for how one might respond when tragedy strikes and when one is in danger of drowning amid chaos. So just before I get to Leviathan, just briefly reflect on Behemoth in retrospect. What the poet depicts in this portion of Yahweh's discourse is neither a particular specimen of animal, nor a maleficent embodiment of evil. Rather, Behemoth is a spectacular exhibit of divine creativity in all its contradictions, an exalted, monstrous other who is neither crushed nor subdued as one might desire, but thrives. Even in the morass, a liminal space between land and chaotic waters, the monster continues to benefit from God's ecological providence. The dreadful monster whom God extols as a creature, as a creative masterpiece like wisdom, teaches by his patient and confident conduct how creatures might respond to adversity. Nature, even in such a monstrous iteration, may be revelatory of divine justice, if only ambiguously. Now we turn to second animal, Leviathan. Modern interpreters frequently cite classical accounts of crocodile hunting to explicate verses 24 to 25. But the rhetorical questions imply negative answer. This is what we cannot do. The example is about catching crocodile, but the point here is you cannot do that. And the analogy with crocodile hunting only works for verses 24 to 26, not the rest of the passage. Furthermore, this interpretation misses the satirical tone of the passage. This understanding of Leviathan, furthermore, contradicts the image of Leviathan elsewhere, not least in 3 verse 8. In 3:8, all scholars recognize Leviathan means Leviathan. But Leviathan here means crocodile. So in 3:8, there's a problem because 3:8a, KJV, NIV, and JPS suggest that curse that day. But other versions suggest to curse the sea. Which is it? Is it day or is it sea? And 3:8b, those who are skilled to rouse Leviathan. The background, I've argued in my volume 1 of the Job commentary, is an Egyptian idea of the chaos monster Apep. So the sun god sails in the bark to the underworld, and meanwhile, the chaos monster tries to stop the bark from going on to begin another day. Right? And so the text is about the suppression of day as well as the sea. It's both. In other case, there's Leviathan. But the passage also reminds us of Ezekiel 29. Ezekiel 29, 3 to 4. Now I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon, the crocodile. I will put hooks in your jaws. I will draw you out. Okay. In 32, 2 to 3, you consider yourself a lion of the nations, but you are a dragon in the seas. I will throw my net over you. They will draw you up. In other words, this is language used for captives of any sort, including political captives. Interestingly, even given this polemic against Egypt, it is interesting to point out that one of the earliest iconographic representation is Namir Palette, where supposedly representing the unifying of the north and south of Egypt. Right? So we see a captive being beaten by a king, and above is a clump of papyrus representing the delta. See? And the king has a rope with a hook to the nose of the ruler of the delta region. And the falcon represents the pharaoh. In other words, this is political language. Right? And we find this elsewhere as well in this inscription from Iran. See, where a king, where the goddess Ishtar brings captives with the rope holding their lips and their noses to present them to the king. Right? Sargon II also sees himself in the text as one who holds the nose ropes So Sargon then blinds his captives and put them on a leash. We have a similar example of Esarhaddon. And the close-up, you can see at the bottom, the rope comes and there's a ring holding the nose and the lip. In other words, all these images suggest that what underlying this is propaganda, and it is about captives of all sorts. So we find in myth as well. In myth, vanquished chaos monsters are taken by a rope, as in Numa Elish. In iconography, deities are frequently shown leading chaos monster by a rope. In politics, the king is seen as one who holds other kings by a lead rope. Kings claim to have given the lead ropes by gods, and kings boasted of leading royal prisoners by their eyes, nose, lips, and jaws. So captive kings refers to chaos monster. And Yahweh's point is that you can't do that with Leviathan. See? Then you get a taunt further. Will human hero, will he multiply pleas for mercy with you or speak vulnerably to you? So do you think Leviathan will come to you to beg for mercy and to beg for a peace treaty? So this is obviously satire, right, of human illusion of grandeur, to be able to control chaos. You can't do that. You are in no position to hold Leviathan captive. Again, we have in myth, Canaanite myth, the high god El surrenders Baal to the chaos monster. Baal is your vessel. Baal is your servant, O sea. Baal is your vessel, O river. The son of Dagon is your captive. And Baal himself surrenders to monstrified monster. I am your vessel, indeed, yours perpetually. We find this language in the Bible as well, when the Philistine king Achish imagined that David would become odious to his own people, and so become a perpetual vessel to the Philistines. So the taunt is that you are in no position to control Mishpat, to control Leviathan as you think you do. Will partners haggle over him? Will he be divided among the merchants? Will you riddle his skin with harpoons, his head with fishing spears? Again, the background of this, we find in Psalm 74, the chaos monster is crushed and given as food to denizens of the wilderness. Ezekiel 29 and 32, Pharaoh is taunted as the great dragon, the crocodile of the Nile, hooked in the jaw, dragged away, and flung as food for the denizens of the wilderness. In Canaanite mythology, chaos monsters defeated are dismembered and cast away as food for the creatures of the wild. Egyptian mythology, dismemberment of the chaos monster is a frequent trope, as we see in these examples. So after the boat has sailed through, you can see a figure at the left side cutting up Leviathan, cutting up Apep, the chaos monster. See? A very common trope. And you find examples here. So the body riddled with knives, that's typical iconography. All these knives are plunged into Apep. See? The knives representing incantations. So the body riddled with knives, very typical of images of Apep, of Apophis, the chaos monster in Egypt. So all this then makes the point that Job is in no position to fight Leviathan. Forget about it, you're not in the same league. Then in 41, you get an ode to Leviathan. And this is a troubling passage because it is very difficult in this passage to distinguish Leviathan from God, especially in verses 1 to 4. The text is very unclear. We do not know whether him or he or I, when it's referring to God and when it's referring to Leviathan. And commentators invariably fix the text so it comes out crystal clear. But the text is unclear. And also Leviathan is cruel, just as God is said to be cruel. But Leviathan mixes fascination and terror, awe and wonder. And the terms for Leviathan's advance are reminiscent of theophany: shine, flashes, flames, fiery spark, smoke, and blazing coals. At his rising, Leviathan's rising, the mighty or the gods fear the founder. And there is none like him on earth, just like there's none like God in heaven. And above all, he is king, just as Yahweh is king in the Psalms. So Leviathan is presented as if you can't distinguish between him and God. Leviathan is wholly other, mysterious and fascinating. So in retrospect, contrary to expectations, there is no divine intervention to suppress chaos. Instead, we find an ode to the chaos monster. The ode to Leviathan is confusing, for we cannot always be sure whether it is God or Leviathan who is in view. But the lack of clarity is indicative of reality, for it can be difficult to separate the notion of a beneficent God from the experience of evil. Indeed, the chaos monster is not obviously antithetical to God, nor is a terrifying monster of chaos necessarily inconsistent with divine nature. The ode to Leviathan mingles fascination and dread, as it presents the monster as both beautiful and terrifying. Terms used of the advance of the monster recall divine theophany, as if to suggest that the monster is somehow a manifestation of God. The monster is dreadful, as indeed God is. So in encountering this monster who brings this devastation and suffering, the poet implies, one encounters the deity as wholly other. In refusing to domesticate the chaos monster, so it's chaos newsome, the poet resists the domestication of God as an awesome, mysterious, and dangerous other. The theological perspective of the poet aligns with other biblical texts from the Persian period. In response to the Persian theological dualism, biblical writers resisted dualistic explanations for origins of good and evil. Rather, they asserted their conviction in one God. As we read in 2nd Isaiah, I am Yahweh, and there is none else. I form light and create darkness. I am maker of weal and creator of woe. I am Yahweh who does all these things. Against Persian dualism, this insistence on only one God who oversees everything, good and evil alike. Writing in the same period, the poet of Job subverts the traditional dichotomy between good and evil in an audacious reimagination of Leviathan. On the one hand, like Behemoth, Leviathan is a creature. On the other hand, he is clearly no mundane beast. There's an unmistakable aura of danger and violence surrounding him. And yet the poet does not paint a picture of an aggressive evil force of sheer darkness. One may even detect in the passage here and there, if only subliminally, reflections of light, hints of purposeful restraint, and the possibility of laughter. Leviathan is neither clearly malevolent nor benevolent, but he is a mysterious other with whom one ought not to tamper. He is powerful, dangerous, fascinating, terrifying, august, mysterious, the monstrous as wholly other. Indeed, in Leviathan, more than any other elements of God's creation, we encounter a God who is utterly sovereign, utterly free. Thank you very much. Mark.
Thanks for the talk. Great talks. I was struggling a little bit with seeing the evil about this figure in this passage.
I didn't say that. I said it's not evil.
So he's not evil at all, and there's no evil mentioned in the passage.
No.
Good, we're on the same page. I'm sorry I misunderstood you.
I always panic when Smith is after me. So
No, that's good.
no, that's the point, right? So all through elsewhere is evil, but here it is not. It becomes the for Yahweh, right? And that's an answer to Job's response, a response to Job's suffering. See, who's responsible? God is. So what? Alan, you look like you have a...
Well, I'm still wondering what any of this has to do with justice. And as you know, there's an alternative tradition of translation
Yes.
that takes mishpat as governance or rulership.
Correct. Yes.
It goes all the way back to the
Yes.
medievals.
Yes.
And given that you've beautifully expounded the
Yes.
nature of Leviathan and Behemoth as having to do with power, not justice, not judgment, why not opt for the more logical translation in
Yeah.
48?
Yeah. So it's one term for all. I do think it means prerogative, but not only that. See, I think it is a different kind of justice than we understand. So I don't want to separate this from all the other rules of justice in the passage.
And it's
Yeah.
casuistical.
Well,
The
it's
idea that
Martin Buber.
it's justice, but it's not justice in the sense that we use the term. Well, come on.
Correct. Yeah. So it's the same Hebrew. So the problem is our interpretation, our need to put one English equivalent to it, and that may not be adequate. So I do think it is about the exercise of divine prerogative. But that prerogative is a just one, even if it's not one we understand. So I'm following my model and Martin Buber, as I discussed yesterday. Yeah. Okay.
To the Leviathan, where it says his chest is like solid stone, solid like nether millstone. Do you think that is a reference more so attributed to Leviathan or to God? Because in one of your previous talks, you were talking about how temples were like footed in like the nether and went up to heaven.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to separate the two, and I think that's deliberate, right? So the point is, Leviathan has a hard body, it's fascinating, it's terrifying, and that's the way God is. So the text doesn't allow us to easily distinguish the two. I think that's part of the point. We cannot always tell this is God and that is. So it forbids us from being dualistic. Kathy.
So, I don't know if this is following up in a sense on Alan's question, but, okay, if mishpat is, we're going to still use justice, but it's not like how we think about it, then, and if there's, Leviathan is not evil, then are we to say, okay, we've got to, evil is not how we think about it
Right,
either?
right.
And
Right.
so, what does that mean?
Yeah. So what I didn't want to do, my original translation was, will you disregard my jurisdiction or my judgment or the like? But I didn't want that to sidestep the issue of justice, which was Job's complaint. So I don't want to dismiss that. So I retain the term justice and argue that because mishpat means all of that, right? And just because we don't understand the fullness of it, doesn't mean we should choose only one meaning. Right. So my answer is very much influenced by Buber, retributive and that retributive and I forget. In the JTS lecture, in fact, you gave that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Seow. Is the dialogue around mishpat, could this be framed in the fact that it's poetry and not prose? Like by the fact that Job is poetry, and in modern context of poetry, we can use words and they can have interpretive or allegorical or all kinds of meanings. And even though we like to be super rational in English, is that possibly an explanation of the dialogue around mishpat?
Yeah, the whole thing is poetry, right? Except for the framework, it's poetry. Yeah, which is why it's so difficult. It's difficult. What I'm resisting is to tend to smooth over the text. You know, and make it clear for God, or yeah, I just want to smooth over the text. Yes, to Kim.
Yes.
Oh,
So I'm still struggling a little bit with the issue of mishpat. So Job complains about his suffering, and he's met with these rather beautiful presentations of the Leviathan and the Behemoth. And at the end of it, it seems God is sovereign, God is wholly other, and so he's free to do as God wants. So what's the place of Job's lament? Or
Job's what?
Lament and complaint. How, because it seems in this particular scenario, it's God's sovereignty that's lifted.
Right.
So how do we reconcile his mishpat with the place of Job?
The lament and complaint is what humans do, and what we must do. But how God responds is God's prerogative. Right? And our understanding may not be God's understanding. So I don't want to see Yahweh as not responding to Job, right?
So I mean, the way God responds is not necessarily the way
Yeah.
it would not be one-to-one how we expect God to. So, but is there still a place
Sure.
for highlighting the
Sure.
process of complaint?
Right. Yeah. So there's no suppression of
Right.
lament, and God does not rebuke Job for the lament and so forth. See, right? What God rebukes is Job's lack of full understanding of the cosmos. Yes.
Thank you. I was really interested in your sort of exposition of verse 19, and so you note in your translation that you amended the reading from the MDiv, house of Yagesh Habo, and his maker may bring sword, and then you amend this quite significantly. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit.
Not the consonants, right? Yeah, not the consonants. We need the vowels. How or so is impossible Hebrew form. How or so is impossible Hebrew form. Therefore, the article and the participle with suffix is impossible Hebrew form.
Right. It seems like you also changed the verb at the very end of Habo,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's following Bungo. Yeah. Yeah. So I've become very concerned. I rarely amend the text unless I have no choice. And this was the case where I had no choice. Yeah.
After your presentation, I'm rethinking a lot about the book of Job right now.
Oh, good.
And that is the way you interpreted justice, right? And then one dominant characteristics that I've been trying to look into when it comes to the book of Job is the use of violent language.
What violence?
Yeah, violent language. So we saw how violent language was used between Job and his friend. And in a way, again, how God used this same violent language to bring about an explanation to some extent to kind of confront Job and to make him to understand what is going on, even if Job wouldn't still understand. So looking at that contrast, do you think it is, do you think it is okay to think towards that direction, using violent language as a means of oppression, and also using violent language as a means of freedom and liberation?
Well, what do you mean by violent language?
Yeah, violent language in this sense is the possible use of language to inflict harm or pain on an individual, right? And this is this interplays in the responses of Job's friend in a way that keeps aggravating Job's emotional feeling and despair in his suffering. So, and then in God's response, there was some sort of languages which came up here, and one of it, the use of thunder sounds to be kind of something that can cause fear to a person. But again, using this language paradigm to more or less explain the situation to Job. So my question is, can we say that violence of language can be used in these two ways, according to the book of Job?
I guess I'm still not getting of what you mean by violence of language. Yeah, so I'm not sure how to answer that. So I'm not sure I understand what do you mean by that. Can you help me? What's meant by violence of language? I'm not getting.
Okay, what I'm saying is that when we look at the book of Job,
Yes.
his friends were coming from a vantage position, which kept Job talking or going in kind of conversation, and that was because the languages they were using in a way to maybe depict Job's situation was not what Job really wanted. And that was why when they were relating Job's suffering to sin, he kept pushing back. So in that way, we saw how a kind of language was interplay of language between Job and his friend.
Yes.
Okay, now, when God was to respond, there were some certain languages which we can underline as language that can also cause fear.
Yes.
One of it is the use
I
of
see that. Yeah.
one of it is the use of tempest, one of it is the use of thunder, and even using leviant is part of the violence of language I'm talking about. But in a different dimension, or in a different way of using language violence or violence of language that we've seen in the earlier chapters of the book. So my question is it correct to say that violence of language in the book of Job was used as both a way of oppression, suppression, and as also a way of liberation and clarification?
I don't know. Yeah, I could think about that. Yeah. I'm not sure how to respond. I've not thought about it in those terms, so it's hard for me to respond. Yes.
I'm not sure. Maybe on a different way, the taunt. If we call that language of violence,
Yeah.
is it in the same way to put Job down and say you're wrong? Is that violence, or is it edification in some way to help Job to understand his situation?
So God does use language. So Job does use the kind of language, right? Job used satire against God, and God used satire back at Job. So you do have that, right? So, but that is the nature of literature, you know. So God uses satire against Job because Job throughout has been using satire against God.
That's our time for tonight, but please continue conversation if you want to come up and talk. I just want to make sure we're on time for our event. But thank you again.
Okay.
And our final lecture is tomorrow. So thank you so much.
Can't come in person tomorrow, so I'll watch you on the YouTube. But I much enjoyed you coming back and giving these lectures.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So many questions.
I couldn't understand the question. I couldn't understand the question.